Alright, it's time to record Pac-Man. Again. I recorded this earlier today, but the audio was screwy. So, now I've got to play Pac-Man again. Which is alright. Pac-Man is a fine game. And I do like playing it. It can be quite addictive. Now, Pac-Man was released in 1980 by Namco. However, in the United States, it was published by Midway. And Pac-Man was pretty much the very first video game icon. I mean, it's not the first video game sensation. That was arguably Space Invaders, which we'll be getting to at some other point. But Pac-Man was the first recognizable video game character. Like, before Pac-Man, there were no real video game characters. You had the paddles from Pong, the block from Adventure, the spaceship from Asteroids. I mean, the Space Invaders themselves were kind of an icon, but not really. But no, Pac-Man, he was the first character. The first full-fledged character. At least in the arcades. The PC market might have been a bit different. There was such a huge cultural phenomenon around this little guy. I mean, Pac-Man was the first video game character to have his own television show, done by Hanna-Barbera. And, as you might imagine, it's not good because it was done by Hanna-Barbera in the early 80s. And I believe I put his theme song on the worst list because it is not it sounds like you're driving a chainsaw through a Pac-Man machine. Speaking of which, the Pac-Man theme itself is very memorable, very iconic. And if you really do want to know about how the gaming industry changed, or get a good example of... If you want... Pac-Man is incredibly historically important. And it should be a no-brainer that it's an absolute yes on a must-play. There's a problem, though. Something that I've dubbed the Pac-Man problem. Because Pac-Man here isn't the best Pac-Man. Objectively speaking, pretty much everyone agrees that Miss Pac-Man, which is a pseudo-sequel to Pac-Man, is the better game by far, which is also in the book. As you can see, in this game, every single level, the map is entirely the same. You're going through this exact same maze 256 times until the game doesn't know how to program anything else. However, Miss Pac-Man, every few levels you get a new maze layout. That was a big deal. But on top of that, the AI in Miss Pac-Man is very much improved. The ghosts here, they do behave independently. However, it can come across as... their moveset can come across as random. It's much more reasonable to know how the ghosts in Miss Pac-Man behave than the ones in the original Pac-Man. On top of that, the graphics and the color scheme are better in Miss Pac-Man. Miss Pac-Man is the better game. And just a back-to-back comparison, as I did play Miss Pac-Man earlier today, not to do a video on it, but just to compare, Miss Pac-Man is far and away more fun to play. I mean, they have the same basic gameplay mechanics, which is a problem here. You see, we have a choice. We can either go with the iconic one, or the better one. One of the games definitely should be in the book. However, placing both of them in the book is a mistake. An understandable mistake, but a mistake nonetheless. Because yes, I think anybody making 1001 Video Games You Must Play Before You Die book would say that Pac-Man should absolutely be a must-play. It's almost a no-brainer kind of thing. Until you actually start applying your brain and realize that Pac-Man is kind of simplistic as far as a maze game goes. Like, here's a sad fact. There are basically rip-offs of Pac-Man that do the Pac-Man shtick better. There was Casey Munchkin, and there was also Ladybug, that both had very, very different ways of going about this. They improved the Pac-Man gameplay. Sometimes by adding in more obstacles, and sometimes by the maze changing up as you played, with certain doors and such. Pac-Man, as it stands on its own, doesn't have much to offer in the way of a unique or strong maze game. It's still fun to play, and it definitely holds up. I want to say that right off the bat. It absolutely holds up. But this is definitely one of the challenges in creating your own 1001 list, or anyone's 1001 video games list. Because it sounds like it should be easy to do, to some extent. But it's not, and this is one of the major issues that can get in your way. If it's not the Defender problem, or I guess the Pokemon problem, which is a little bit more apt, it is a game like this. Because Pac-Man here isn't the only game to have this problem, where the most groundbreaking games of all time have become quite a bit outdated, or they've been surpassed future on in their series. Because Pac-Man isn't the best Pac-Man game. I mean, it's been surpassed by its own sequels, like Pac-Man Jr., or Pac-Man Championship Edition, which is also got into the book, which we'll be getting to at some other time. Prize. Alright. So, yeah, I suppose we should talk about this, because I understand that so far, I have been very harsh on the book. We're now 10 games in, which I am going to count as 1%. And it's definitely not the best sample size, but it is a sample size so far. And right now, not including Pac-Man's Judgment here, whatever it may be, 9 games so far, 3 of them have been no-goes. I've said no out of basically a third of the time. One of those games was filler. Complete and utter filler. The other 2 games at least had something going for them. Facade was an interesting experiment at the very least, and had some unintentional humor. And Quadradius was alright. But I suppose we do have to talk about... One thing that often does come up is there 1001 video games that you must play before you die? As of now. Because compared to the other books that have gotten the 1000 whatever you must do before you die books, video games are a relatively new medium. Like, the first one was movies. Movies have been around since the 1890s, and the first one in the book came out in 1902. And the last one came out in around 2010. Then there's 1001 books you must read before you die. Books have been around for 6,000 years. You're definitely going to easily be able to come up with the ones that you need to complete the set. I am not wording myself the best right now. The point is that video games have been around for about 48 years now. You can consider Pong as where the industry began. Although, yes, it was not the very first video game. I didn't say that's where video games in general began. It's where the industry began. So, we're not even 50 years in. Which means that time is not exactly on our side here. However, I don't know if that's a very good case against the possibility of there being 1001 video games out there that must be played to have a full experience. And the reason is because video games seem to be produced more often and faster than most other mediums. Like, compare it to a movie, for instance. It's very, very hard for some average Joe in their basement to just pump out an awesome movie that gets all the ratings and is considered the next big thing. I think the only time that that's ever happened was with, like, the Blair Witch Project. However, when it comes to video games, this kind of thing, especially lately, has been happening all the time. With games like Five Nights at Freddy's, Undertale, Minecraft, all games made essentially by one person that have taken the world by storm in one way or another. That's something that seems to be largely unique to video games. Not to mention that hundreds of video games come out every single year, and that's before things like Early Access or Steam Greenlight. Like, the barrier to entry of creating a video game is incredibly, incredibly low. And while that does have a downside, the amount of video games, just by sheer probability, means that there are going to be more must-plays. Like, the NES was around for, what, 5-6 years? And it has 700 games on it, which translates to about 100 games per year on one console alone. The PlayStation came out in 1995 and had a similar time span, being retired at 2001 when the PlayStation 2 came out. It had 1,700 games on it. Like, there aren't 100 movies being released every year. Unless you count, like, the really obscure shit. Like, I'm talking mainstream movies. The barrier to entry of creating a video game is exceedingly low. And the number of games that are simply out there is much, much higher if we're counting other countries. Which is one of the failings of the book, I think. It only seems to focus on games that have been released in English. There are only 2 games in the entire book that I think are exclusive to Japan. 3 if you count Lost Levels. The other games are Mother 3 and Fatal Frame 4. Every other game, I think, has been released in the United States, at least. But there are definitely plenty of other games that would certainly be considered a must-play that have never been released in the United States. Like, for example, LSD Dream Emulator. I know a lot of people don't like that game, think it's too minimalistic, or there's not much of a point. But that's not what I consider a must-play. Must-play transcends good or bad. It's interesting, it's unique. Maybe it's really fun, maybe it's got the most beautiful story ever told in games. But under that definition, I think that LSD Dream Emulator is a game that absolutely must be played. It was never released in the States. And there are plenty of other games like that, like Captain Rainbow, or Giftopia. And that's only games that are Japanese exclusive. That's ignoring Korean games, Russian games, Other countries that have surprisingly big video game scenes. And of course, there are many, many other obstacles to figuring out this puzzle. The most prominent one being, what do you classify as a video game? Like, I think I've talked about this briefly before when talking about Facade. But when you're making a 1001 video games list, or what do you count as a video game? Like, walking simulators or whatever, I think most people would at least give games like, say, the Stanley Parable a chance to be on the list, if they're really, really good, or like Dear Esther, which are really, really well known. But the question also arises when it comes to visual novels. Like, I don't think many people would have a problem considering dynamic visual novels video games, even though some people don't consider any visual novels video games. But things like Doki Doki Literature Club or Hatoful Boyfriend. Those are games visual novels that could easily be considered 1001 video games you must play. I mean, technically speaking, Phoenix Wright is a visual novel, and most people would include at least one of those games as a 1001. Come on. Damn it! But what about kinetic visual novels? Visual novels that just tell you a story and give you absolutely no input. And I mean, I guess you could say that you could consider dynamic visual novels a video game and kinetic novels not one. But there's always a line. Or like, there is never a line. Like, what if a almost entirely kinetic novel gives you a very brief chance to change things? Like Lucy, the Eternity She Wished For. That's a mostly kinetic visual novel that, one, it calls itself a game in certain places, and two, it does allow you to give very minor inputs that don't change anything. New high score. Like, what would you do with those in considering a 1001 video games you must play before you die? It's kind of hard to come up with the definition of a video game at all. It is sort of a more you know it when you see it kind of thing. And yes, in the original Pac-Man, sometimes you accidentally go through your ghosts. I'm not entirely sure why. I mean, the game's not perfect. I'm just gonna die again on purpose so I can give it another shot. I suppose before we do any evaluations, I should come up with my answer on Pac-Man. And I think I do want to establish something right now. Historical significance alone is not enough for me to consider a game a must-play. If it's been surpassed by its own sequels, its own spin-offs, and even basically rip-offs. Like, we're going to be seeing this again throughout a lot of the book. Like, games that are just very iconic, but they've been so surpassed. Like, for example, the original Dragon Quest. That game is one of the most important games ever created. It basically founded what we know as the modern JRPG. All the cliches that we have come to associate with the genre basically started there, for better or worse. How is that game played? You grind for 20 hours, you search for invisible items, then you beat a boss. I mean, that's a bit of an exaggeration, but yeah, that's the majority of the game. There's both every reason that people should play that now, and absolutely no reason that anybody should play that game now. And it doesn't even have to be with the same series. For example, Theme Park. Theme Park, the DOS game made by Bullfrog, is super iconic, and everyone seems to love it. The problem is that Roller Coaster Tycoon exists. And I've tried to play Theme Park, being tried. I could never get past the interface and figure out what the fuck you're supposed to do. So that one is probably going to be a no matter how iconic it is, because nowadays we have Roller Coaster Tycoon, Planet Coaster, Parkitect. And yes, it's absolutely true that we would have none of those if it wasn't for Theme Park. But that's not a reason to play Theme Park. That's not a reason that Theme Park is a must-play. And just because Pac-Man was such an amazing impact doesn't mean it's reason to play it nowadays. I mean, it's definitely reason to appreciate Pac-Man. But this isn't 1001 video games you must appreciate. It's 1001 video games that you must play. And I will say that Miss Pac-Man is better. It's on the list. And that's why I have to say no to Pac-Man. It's probably going to be one of the most painful cuts of the entire book, but it's something that needs to be done. Because in making a list like this, at some point you're going to need to make very hard, very painful cuts. If you don't, well, you end up with a bunch of filler and a half-baked product. But, okay. It's not that Pac-Man is a bad game, but if you're going to play one of these 80s arcade Pac-Man games, play Miss Pac-Man. Which I'm not covering in this episode because Miss Pac-Man has plenty of interesting things to talk about on its own. That can sustain its own episode. It's not like Stargate and Defender, which is just the same fucking thing. Miss Pac-Man has more culture behind it, too. I don't think it's much of a secret that Pac-Man Hero was one of the first games designed specifically to help appeal to women. But that's something that I want to talk about more in the Miss Pac-Man video, which should be fun. Because there's a lot of history and a lot of context that I think has been lost to the passage of time to those who don't bother to research history. But we are officially 10 games in, even though it's not technically 1%, that would be about 11 games. I think I want to consider every 10 games another percent. The 1001th game at the end is just going to be a bonus. So, how is the book doing at 1% in? With Pac-Man, that's 4 no's and 6 yeses. That is a D-. Literally barely passing, at least in the United States. Maybe it's just a bad selection of games, but I don't think this trend is going to change much as we go on, to be totally honest. I mean, I know it's not the best sample size in the world, but so far I played 3 extremely super genre-defining classics, that being Pong, Pac-Man, and Super Mario Brothers. I played one of my favorite games of all time with ActRaiser. I played a very influential influential game with Defender. I played a weird artistic experiment with Facade. I played a couple of fun browser games. Small little casual things. And I played V6, which is just fun. I do think it's at least a decent sample size this far in. But yeah, I'm 1% in. I want to say that this means that I am in it for the long haul, but I'll probably only be in it for the long haul after I've accomplished something very, very difficult or very, very tedious. I mean, so far the book is not doing well. While a D- is passing, we consider it passing, but not really. You're still in fucking trouble. You might as well have failed if you get a D-. Also, Pac-Man, first game with cutscenes. There were a lot of firsts here, but there are plenty of other firsts in video games that, if you go down that route, you're gonna throw in everything. Like, Jumping Flash was the first 3D platformer in 1995, a whole year before Super Mario Bros. I played it, it's pretty much meh. It's basically a hide-and-seek simulator with a robot bunny. There's not much reason to play it. Mystery House was the first text-based adventure with a graphical interface. I've never heard anyone talk about anything else about Mystery House except that one little aspect of it. There we go. I mean, you can be doing this all day, just coming up with absolute firsts. But as they say, it's not who did it first; it's who did it best. Also, I think I didn't answer my question. Do I believe that there's 1,000 and do I personally believe that there's 1,001 video games that you must play before you die? I mean, the book also poses this question, and it's really cheeky about it, too. No, there's not 1,001 video games you must play. There's something like 2,700, but that doesn't sound so good on a title. Even though it's themed to the other books in the series. Hey, buddy, if there's that many games you must play before you die, why the hell did you put in shit like Demigod and Army of Two, the 40th Day, and Lumina's Live? Some of the stuff you had to cut out. Like, that's definitely just being cheeky. When there's clearly tons of filler in the book. Do I personally believe there's 1,001 video games you must play before you die? I think that there is. It's just hard to come up with all the answers. Like, there's plenty of series that I need to get into and I need to explore, because I'm not as knowledgeable in everything as I should be. Like, there are some genres I'm just painfully hopeless at least in the knowledge department, like JRPGs. I really wish I was more versed in them, like Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy, even. Like, there's some series I know off the back of my hand, like The Legend of Zelda. There's some series that I followed for a while and kinda fell off of, like the Super Mario Bros. Like, after Galaxy, I don't know which ones are must-plays or not. With the exception of Odyssey, which I think most people would say is a must-play. I don't even need to play it to know how much of a cultural impact it's already having. But yeah, there's a lot of genres that I need to experience more, because I personally don't have all the knowledge I need to give an absolute definitive answer. But in my heart of hearts, I do truly believe that there are 1001 video games you must play before you die. You just gotta find them all. You know, it's like Pokemon, you gotta catch them all. All 1001. You know, that's just 8 generations. It's not a deal. Not a problem. Oh god. Yes. In the 8th generation, there's probably going to be over 1,000 Pokemon. Oh my god. That's going to be fucking insane. Or the biggest cultural milestone in Pokemon history. Wow. But yeah, if you want to include dynamic visual novels, if you want to include video games that were never released in the United States or translated into English, the most obscure artistic things, and, like, just take a look on Congregate, for instance. How many games are on there? There has to be at least a few must-plays. Like Epic Fantasy Battle 3. Which, when I played it, it was fucking hilarious. I bought the sequel, I haven't played it yet, so I'd have to figure out which one is better, but yeah, one of those games, at least, is absolutely certainly a must-play. And it was a Flash game. One Chance. One Chance is another Flash game that I can consider a must-play. And you can find all sorts of interesting things all over the place. The DS has this weird music creation game called Electroplankton, which sounds like it would be a must-play. I need to have further exploration into all these things, because right now I'm just shooting in the dark. Because there are a lot of things I've heard of in passing that I haven't played. But they definitely sound like they'd absolutely be must-plays. Oh, yes, you may not have known this, but the ghosts have nicknames: Inky, Blinky, Pinky, and Clyde. Although that's not their actual names. Like, the red one here, I think, is actually named Shadow. One of them is named Speedy. Or maybe that's what they do. I don't know. But they are all known as Inky, Blinky, Pinky, and Clyde. Which, I don't know, I like it. But yeah, I certainly do believe that there's 1001 video games you must play. And like I said, it's been one of the longest side quests in my life to figure out what they all are. Although I should really encourage myself to play more games, because like most people, I have a shit ton of Steam games that I bought on sale that I have never had a chance to explore, because I'm too busy playing the same game I have already for the next 100 hours. Like, why do I want to take a chance on something new when I could play Stardew Valley for another 100 hours? You ever get that feeling? I get it way too often. Also, if you're wondering, my goal here was to get an extra life. That is my goal in arcade games. In Pac-Man, you get an extra life at 10,000 points. Not every 10,000 points. At 10,000 points, you get an extra life. Then at 30,000 points, you get an extra life. And so on and so on. And one of the worst things in the world, one of the worst feelings in the world, is being cornered like that. Although there are ways to avoid it if you think strategically, although sometimes you'll slip up. Unless you're one of those expert players who knows how to get the absolute perfect Pac-Man score. Which I am not. I mean, technically completing any arcade game would be making it to the kill screen, but I want to finish this game. I want to finish this list before I die. That's kind of the point. Not after I die. I think I accidentally hit 2 players, but whatever. Once again, I am using MAME. And if you're wondering, I'm using an Xbox 360 controller. Because I think that best emulates the original controls. And plenty of these games you can buy on the Xbox Live Arcade anyway. Is that still around? I honestly don't know. I haven't had an Xbox since the 360. Like most people, I'm most used to video game history I grew up with, and have a hard time thinking that it's history. Oh my god, the Wii is over 10 years old. That's... I don't know, maybe that's because of all the retro revivals hiding the fact how far we've... hiding the fact that we're in the future now. If you're being chased by the ghosts, it's often a good strategy to just turn instead of going straight. The ghosts go faster than you in a straight line. However, you go faster than them when you turn. That's how you stop them from gaining on you. And of course, every time you get a power pellet, you want to eat as many ghosts as possible. Did you know that Pac-Man had a top 10 hit about him? I think it was by Buckner and Garcia. Let me see. Yeah, Buckner and Garcia, who basically were one-hit wonders who had this album full of songs inspired by arcade games. And I want to say that it's cheesy and ridiculous as hell, but look around on YouTube now and find all the songs inspired by Animal Crossing, Minecraft, Bendy, Undertale. It seems like something that is coming back in vogue. But I guess Buckner and Garcia were the pioneers of all of this. Talking about these epic songs about Frogger, or Centipede, or Defender. And by the way, yes, I was listening to Buckner and Garcia while I was playing Defender. Although, their Frogger song is probably my favorite, excluding the one that they did on the Wreck-It Ralph soundtrack. Yeah, Disney apparently dug up this band to do a Wreck-It Ralph song for the movie. And honestly, it's the best thing that they ever recorded, and I mean that earnestly. It sounds the best. Pac-Man Fever, while it's their most famous song, is not their best. As far as their classic work goes, the Froggy's Lament all the way. But I obviously can't play that song for you now because of copyright. Although, he wasn't the first guy to make a a hit song or a pop song themed around video games. Because there was a song based on Space Invaders, which actually doesn't get tagged by YouTube for some reason. But it's just called Space Invaders by Player One. Which also sounds phenomenally cheesy. I don't know, 80s cheese just sounds good and appealing to me. I mean, not actual literal food cheese, but musical cheese, absolutely. And I would definitely be listening to the song right now, but, OBS would pick it up, and I think Fraps would too. So, no, I can't listen to cheese right now. And that's, so far, my high score up there. I'm not one of the big, high-scoring players in Pac-Man. The highest score you can achieve is basically 33 million. Like, which technically is the world record, but, it's going to be the world record forever because you cannot score higher. Like, I mean, technically I'm not showing you everything that happens in Pac-Man, but basically with arcade games, the further you go, the less the developers expected you to get that far, and the more the game kind of breaks. But to get that amazing score, not only do you need to get every pellet and every single fruit that appears, you need to not die once. Ever. And you need to get all 4 ghosts with all 4 power pellets every single time until they stop turning blue. Yes, there's a point in the game where the ghosts stop turning blue when you get power pellets, because the time on them has become so short. I mean, it's easy to notice that in every level, the time they turn blue gets shorter and shorter and shorter. That doesn't go on infinitely. At a certain point, they stop turning blue. And yeah, there are probably more cutscenes that we haven't been seeing, but I don't think it really matters. And it's going to be the same deal for Miss Pac-Man, even though that follows, those cutscenes in that game follow a more clear story. And this will certainly be my last game. Pac-Man, while it's definitely a good game, and it's super important, it's been surpassed way too many times, and I can't find myself... Well, I can find a reason to include it, I just can't justify those reasons. Miss Pac-Man all the way, and I suppose I've given away the answers for a few future games, but... we'll get to Miss Pac-Man when we get to Miss Pac-Man. No, I am not playing it next. Because I want to play something differently. Maybe we'll get out of the 80s, I don't know. Come on, come on. I do really not like this siren-esque sound you get when he's not eating anything. There's my high score, 26,690. Yeah, Shadow, Speedy, Bashful, and Pokey. Alright, that's it for today. 43 minutes and 55 seconds, okay.